Right, good afternoon everyone. Apologies for the slight delay there. So I'd like to welcome Daniel Pocock, who's going to talk to us about distributing voice over IP applications and packages. So welcome to Daniel.
Yeah, it's always a thrill to be here in the UK. Actually quite close to where I used to live when I lived here in the UK before. So I started with Linux and ham radio, which is my introduction to communications technology, back at about the same time in the 90s in Australia. I was introduced to Debian in 1997. So Debian is one of the major Linux distributions. Who uses Debian here? Yep. And who uses Fedora as well? I use Fedora too. And who's using Red Hat or CentOS? Yep. So there are a lot of distributions, and most of us are familiar with more than one of them. Debian is the one I have the most experience with. Despite starting with Debian in 1997, I didn't actually start publishing packages in Debian until about 2012. I'd been creating packages myself and also managing other free software projects myself, but I hadn't actually made packages of these things. But in 2012, I decided to become part of the Debian organization and actually publish my packages and make it easier for other people to get them. At the time, I didn't want to put Debian on my CV, for example. I didn't need to be part of Debian to get a job. I simply wanted to make it easier for people to get packages for SIP. One of the biggest packages I maintain being Reciprocate. Now at that point, it's about 15 years I'd been doing things with Debian and I'd never taken this step. And reflecting on that, I think one of the things that put me off was the appearance of the bureaucracy and the application process. It does take a long time to become involved in some of the free software communities or to get access rights to commit to repositories. But nonetheless, I really wanted to help the community, so I decided to push ahead with that. And when I come to events like this, people often ask me, how can I get my software into Debian as well? Or how can I get my software into Fedora? So I'm also a Fedora developer. And they're not quite ready to go through the process. And so I have a chat with them about how we can work together to do that. So all of those interactions inspired this talk today. So what is a package? A distribution like Debian or Fedora, OpenSUSE is made up of packages. So a package simply takes the binary files of an application and sets them out in your system in the right place. Sorry about that. I should just turn it off. So a package can also include some logic to help configure that software so that it will work the first time that you use it. A typical example is creating a user account on your system, creating a database schema, maybe putting some data in the database to initialize it. So all of this is done through the package. Packages also give you the benefit that you can easily remove them. So if you try something and you don't like it, you can take it off your system, and hopefully the system will be in the state that it was in before you installed the package. What is distribution about? So we have Linux distributions like Debian and Fedora that I've mentioned already, and they distribute these packages to people. So what are some of the key features of a distribution? So a distribution publishes the packages in a location where it's easy for other people to get them. Although then again, you might simply be distributing them within your company using the same techniques. A distribution provides a coherent set of related packages. So in the space that we're working in real-time communications, some projects like Asterisk or Reciprocate or FreeSwitch have a lot of dependencies, and you need to have a suitable version of each one. Some of the WebRTC projects have a lot of node dependencies, and once again, you have to have very specific versions of each dependency. So a distribution aims to have the right versions of things so that everything will work together. Operating system distributions like Debian or Fedora also provide a way to install the system. So if you're using something like Google Play or F-Droid to distribute packages, that doesn't provide a mechanism to install Android on your phone. It just provides a package distribution. But Linux distributions also give you an installation mechanism. And the final point is a distribution gives you a way to establish that the packages come from a source that you trust. That code was actually built from the original source tarball from the developer. So if I make a release of Reciprocate, most people using Reciprocate would like to know that the binary package from Fedora is really built from my source code and not something that was modified. Because a modification may just change the behavior in unpredictable ways, or it might even compromise the security of the software. So having a way of ensuring that packages are trustworthy is an important part of the distribution problem. So some examples of packaging. The first row in the table is the Debian package. We distribute these through an apt repository, which can work over HTTP or other mechanisms. You can mirror these repositories. The second one is the RPM for Red Hat, Fedora, OpenSUSE. It's very similar to apt. Then we have Node, so JavaScript code. So this is not like a Linux distribution. This is simply for web development or for people who develop server-side or client-side applications written in JavaScript. NPM is a tool that lets you get those packages. JARS for Java. Who's a Java developer here? I like Java as well. And then you've got APKs for F-Droid and Google Play. So apps have become popular in the last decade or so with the rise of smartphones. And they've shared some of the concepts of Linux distributions. There are alternatives to packaging. People can still go and take a download of a source tarball. These days it's very popular to clone something in Git and then check it out and build it locally, maybe forking it or making a branch with some local changes. And this is quite valid in some cases. People distribute things as Docker containers or Docker images that you can run, and you can also extend them in different ways. And that competes a little bit with packaging. And then you have appliances. You can download a whole ISO image of an appliance that is just ready to run. There's often a hybrid solution. You might be using Docker, but it can still be beneficial to have packages in the Docker environment because you might want to test some of that code on other workstations or laptops where you just install them as a package. So packaging is still important even if you're running Docker in production. So the benefit of packaging and distribution is that you can install the same thing over and over again all around the world. And you can save a lot of time and effort because it makes it very easy to do that. But what are some of the problems we face in packaging? So one of the problems I've encountered is the dependencies changing. So when you work as part of a big distribution like Debian or Fedora, other people are changing things in the distribution. So I mentioned before that a distribution should give you a coherent set of packages that will work together. But in the development phase, people will publish, say, a new version of the compiler, and when you try to compile your code with that, it might break, so your package is broken. Who actually uploads packages into Debian or Fedora or another distribution already? Who has experienced that? And have you had that experience of your package was working one day and the next day you got an email that it doesn't compile anymore because somebody else changed something? You've seen that? Yeah. So this is one of the challenges, that you need some. It's better if you have some coordination about these changes in the distribution, but it doesn't always happen. Sometimes it just hits you by surprise. So there's a constant effort to keep up with the other changes in the distribution. This can be, tiring for people. You need to set aside time to do this. But nonetheless, the benefits outweigh the effort for most packages. Another thing that I've encountered is the bureaucracy in distributions, and this varies between every project. So looking at some of the lighter problems, one example is the review swap. Does anyone know what I'm talking about when I talk about review swaps? So you create a package of something and you upload it to a community, and before they will accept your package, they want you to review a package that somebody else created. So this is an extra effort for you before your package will proceed. I don't want to name the communities that do this. It's something that some of them are testing to see if it helps or if it frustrates people. But ultimately, if you're a developer and you have a long list of things to do, the review swap or reviewing someone else's package might not feel like the most important thing you could be doing at that time. You just want to get your package out there for your users. So some distributions have tried things like this because they want to have a peer review of the packages. They want to encourage people to improve their packaging skills. And the review swap has some benefits, but it does take time to do it properly. I personally don't want to just go and do a review of someone's package in 5 minutes just to get my own package through, because if I don't do it properly, if I don't spend an hour on it, then I might approve something that has bugs in it or security problems or whatever else, or license problems. And the biggest challenge that people are thinking about today is that when you contribute to some of the larger organizations, you give a lot of power to the organization. We've seen this with Debian, with Fedora. You look at something like Wikimedia that's not a software project, it's a information-based project, but where you've got a lot of people making small contributions, and the organization itself becomes very, very powerful and influential thanks to the contributions of lots and lots of people around the world. So every time you contribute, you make the organization more powerful for better and for worse. So this has benefits but also disadvantages. So one of the things we saw recently in Debian was a long discussion of somebody's membership over Christmas. It's a very, very challenging time for people. It's basically a trial by social media. I've removed the person's name from this screenshot. But the effect of this is kind of like the medieval practice of putting someone in the stocks. And it's really, really sad when someone's been contributing to a project for 10 years and something like this happens. But this has been happening in a number of communities recently. Every community has tried to introduce a code of conduct, which is great in principle, but it's also led to some discussions about how should this work in practice, and many people have different ideas. And when you see something like that email thread we saw before, what it's telling us is that the obligations in that code of conduct outweigh the rights of the member. So to be more specific, about 3 years ago someone was sort of pushed out of Debian. They were given 48 hours to respond to concerns about their activities. But when this incident happened at Christmas, the member wasn't given the 48 hours to respond. They were simply pushed out, and then the discussion happened afterwards. So that's why I've reduced the size of the members' rights on the left side and increased the size of the obligations on the other side. So I'm not against codes of conduct. I'm not against improving safety in the community. I think those are great things in principle, but we need to watch closely when something like this happens. So when you have large organizations, and every distribution is a large organization today, there's always a risk that people think, well, look, I want to focus on my development or my packages and let some other team deal with these social problems. But in fact, the effort that it's caused for developers in Debian is actually more than the effort that goes into our packaging, even though we have another team that's meant to look after it. So just looking at some of the problems you have, not as a developer or publisher of packages, but as a user of packages. So maybe you run Debian on your laptop like me. So one of the problems is that you don't get the latest version of some piece of software. And this can be a good thing. There might be bugs in that new version, and while it's waiting to be packaged, users who downloaded the source tarball will discover the bugs, and the developers will fix them, and a bug fix release will come out, and that is the release that will get packaged. So that delay can be good for you. But on the other hand, if you already have found a bug that's making it difficult for you to use the package, and you're waiting for the new version that has the fix, you might not want to wait 3 months for it to arrive. So this is one of the challenges. The second challenge that comes to mind is packages that disappear. And they disappear for many reasons. Who is a web developer here? Yeah, so Dan's a web developer. So Dan actually spoke about React and also mentioned Node the other day. And who's had the experience of Node packages disappearing? Yes. So this is a challenge we have as a consumer of packages, that things can disappear. In Debian, we've had issues where a maintainer, who is a volunteer, simply decides they cannot maintain the package anymore. So the new Debian 10 Buster was released on the weekend. It is missing some applications that were in Debian 9 stretch. So if you're using those applications and you update your system, you will still have the old version of that application, and it may or may not work on the new system because someone stopped maintaining it. With Debian, you can still go and get the old versions from an archive, though. It's very unusual for something to disappear completely. And a third problem for us as users of packages are the trust mechanisms. So in some systems like Google Play, there's very little verification of what gets uploaded. The only thing Google really does is that they check that each new version of a package is uploaded by the same person who uploaded the last version. So somebody can't come into Google Play and impersonate a developer unless they hack that person's account. But otherwise, there's no obligation on the developer to release their source code. There's no verification that there are no viruses or backdoors in that app. So that's a big challenge for the user. So the user often installs apps on their phone because it's so convenient to do so. But then they put themselves at the risk of things that haven't been verified. So the convenience of packaging also leads to that problem. In Debian, we have over 1,000 developers who can contribute, but there are only 2 keyring managers. Is it possible for the keyring managers to actually know all the developers personally? Or is that keyring now unmanageable from a security perspective? It's an interesting discussion that hasn't been had. And in fact, the time that was spent discussing one member's mistake may have been better spent discussing the fact that the keyring has got so big. because there could be other trust issues with people who are quietly doing things that don't draw any attention. Another problem we have with trust is that when you first upload a package for the first time, that package is reviewed by another person, the FTP master. They mainly review the packages for licensing and also to make sure that there is no binary code in the package. But a week later, you upload another version of the package. It's not reviewed again the next time. Now, anyone can go and review it if they want to, because all the code in Debian is published, but it's not a mandatory part of the process. The review by a second person is only certain to take place on the first upload of that package. So when you download things from Debian or you install packages, and the same with any other distribution, the longer it's been in the distribution, the less likely it is that it's been reviewed by multiple people. Now, people may be reviewing it and they may not be saying anything, but things can be there. The maintainer is trusted to keep uploading new versions. So there's a trust issue there that no one has really spoken about in great detail. It's still better than the alternative of downloading things where we have no source code at all, but there is an element of risk. It's not a perfect system. Looking specifically at real-time communication and telephony, our users need to talk to each other, and they want to do it now. If it doesn't work, they're just going to uninstall your app or your package, and they're going to try something else because they can't wait. Whatever phone call they want to make, they'll just go and use their mobile phone, or they'll go to a proprietary solution or an app from somebody else. Maybe with an open source word processor, they can wait a couple of hours to open a document. But when it comes to making a phone call, people don't like to wait that long. So our packages probably have to work better than anything else in the free software ecosystem. Another thing is the compatibility between packages. So if I have a certain package and the person I want to call has an older version of the package, we may not be able to communicate with each other. So it's also really important to be able to get the latest versions of the package to all the users. And distributions don't look too favorably on this. Distributions prefer stability and predictability. So everyone in a big organization like a university, if they're all running Debian on the same version of Debian, and they all install a soft phone, they'll all get the same version of that soft phone, and they may all work together. But as soon as they want to have a call with somebody outside that university, that soft phone may not work if it's 2 years old. But that's the approach that Debian has taken. And the same with something like CentOS, is that the version of the package stays the same over the life of that release of the operating system. So in a fast-moving field like real-time communication, things are changing much faster than the distributions. Like Fedora is released almost every 6 months, but many of us are releasing things every few weeks. So this is just to emphasize the need for speed in not only in our own release processes, but also in releasing the packages and getting them out to our users. And the approach taken by the distributions is more like a bulk shipping tanker. So it can move a lot of software, but not so fast. Whereas with real-time communication, we need a process that's more like the sports car. So talking about problems is never easy or fun. So I've raised some technical challenges and some social challenges and also the interaction between them. But I'd like to look at 3 specific ideas that could be helpful to us, especially in real-time communication, in dealing with those challenges or working around them. So the first idea I want to raise is making smaller key rings. So I've mentioned that in Debian, we have this huge keyring of 1,000 developers. And many of the developers don't know other developers personally. So what if we had a... Sorry, my laptop is now out of sync with the display. Okay, so this represents that huge keyring. So what if we were to break that up into lots of small keyrings? So imagine all of those who know each other through real-time communications, creating a keyring of maybe 50 or 60 keys from developers from each project, that we all know each other, we all recognize each other, we all meet each other at these events, and we're willing to trust each other to release new versions of that code that we depend on. So that could be an interesting alternative to this large keyring. It's just one suggestion. The keyring, you then have the challenge of how do you distribute that keyring. So the second idea I want to raise is distributing the packages through IPFS. Who has heard of IPFS? Yep. So IPFS is like a file system built on BitTorrent. So who's used BitTorrent? Yeah. So you imagine if you download a package, or if you download a node package, or if you download a source tarball, or even if you check something out from Git, that instead of just saving it on your disk, you put that into IPFS, because it's already a public document or a public object from a web server anyway. So if it goes into IPFS, then it will always be there as long as at least one person is interested in using it. So you can see very quickly that this eliminates that problem of node packages disappearing, doesn't it? And in a world like Debian, it also provides ways to work around the problems of different versions of software. So some people want the stable version, some people want the bleeding edge version. We can all put our own local builds of packages into that IPFS cloud. You still have trust problems though. So one of my suggestions is that we take that keyring that we built, which is basically a group of PGP keys from each developer, we put them into a keyring file, and we put the keyring file into the IPFS as well, so other people can get it easily. And so it's distributed, it's tamper-proof because of the checksums. It's a little bit like using a Git repository that has checksumming on each commit. The next problem with that is how do you know that a binary that comes from that IPFS cloud is really trustworthy? So the suggestion I have there is that different people can run build servers. Anyone can volunteer to run a build server and just build the code and publish the checksum they got from building that binary. And if they all match, then you know there's a high probability that that binary is correct and trustworthy. You might be willing to trust just one of those build servers if you know and trust the operator of the server. But if you don't, you might choose to trust a pool of those operators. This solves another problem as well. There's a big discussion in Debian recently about accepting some very large donations from certain corporations and using that money to buy more servers to build things. But if we could have a distributed way of building packages like this, where anyone can volunteer CPU cycles to build the packages, then we don't need to have a centrally maintained build servers, and we don't need to rely on the donations to keep buying them and keeping them running. So it makes an organization more independent and distributed. But back to the core principle of a file sharing network is, as long as at least one person is interested, the package is always there. So the third suggestion I want to make, and the first was the keyring, the second was using IPFS as a distribution mechanism, and the third suggestion is to make your own images of Debian or whichever operating system you're recommending to people. So when you recommend Debian to another user, whether it's a family member, a friend, a neighbor, maybe it's someone you work with, maybe you're installing it at your company, what you're saying to them is that they should trust the person who produced that image, which was not you. So what I'm suggesting is, if you produce your own image, which is actually quite easy, there are scripts to do this, and if you put a link to your own Debian repository where you publish your packages in that image, and if you also put your own key there, whether you're a Debian developer or not, then when people use your image, they're trusting you over and above the people who produced the operating system. But they already did that anyway because they were trusting your recommendation to use that operating system. So I make this suggestion very seriously because we've had a lot of these issues where projects fork and where people argue over which is the real solution or the right way forward. We've seen people arguing over things like systemd and whatever else. But at a personal level, when you're working with someone and helping them to get started with Linux, they're putting their trust in you. So why not represent that with the image of the operating system that you give them? You're perfectly entitled to do that because there's a free software license says that you can modify that code, you can add a link to your repository, and you can add your key. It's fully in compliance with the license. And don't hide it from people. Put your name on it to say that this is your version of Debian, that you've linked back to your distribution where you've added some extra packages. You don't have to take responsibility for maintaining the compilers or web browsers. You might only distribute one other package yourself. And you can tell people you're doing that. You can put your name on the installer as well, just so that it's clear to people where it came from, that it has been modified in some way, and they know what they're getting. So if they pass it to their friend as well, then that next person is going to know where it came from, and they can ask about that if it bothers them. So I'd like to finish there and open up to any questions that people have.
So who has some questions of Daniel? There's one over here.
Maybe just to get your idea on that, one challenge that companies have, especially, or like people that support Linux users, companies that use Linux, is that the fragmentation. And regarding your last comment or like suggestion, wouldn't this lead to more fragmentation, makes it ultimately more difficult for people to use Linux?
Yep. It's a really good question. I think it's really important to remember that these are very high-level suggestions. I haven't offered any code today, I'm sorry. And I haven't offered all the details, but at a high level, the suggestion is that you provide your own build of the Debian CD that links back to your packages that you want to offer people. And as part of that, to give people confidence in that, we may want to look at ways to make it even more obvious which packages come from the Debian servers and which packages come from you. That can be done through the Synaptic and other GUIs that people use to install packages. So it's an important thing because sometimes you yourself might want to try the default version of something, and sometimes you might want the modified version. And not only that, at any given time, you might want to know on this system, is it modified or is it not modified? As you might be troubleshooting and you have to report a bug. So it is important to be clear about that, but it shouldn't be a blocker. So the transparency is the important thing. So.
Yeah, for the Wazo platform, that's what we are doing, by the way. We are building a set of packages that are signed by our GPG key, and we are providing an ISO. And I have also a question. Did you consider the Fedora module system? Because it's also a way to solve the problem of installing multiple versions in parallel, and you can activate a module or not. And you have multiple streams of particular software that can be used if you want to update. For example, if you have Node at one version, you can have it in a module, and you can have the next version in another module, and you choose the one you use.
Okay, so on the first question, or the first comment about the ISO you build yourself, so that's an installer ISO, or it's just an ISO of packages?
That's an installer, yeah.
Okay. And which Debian do you use?
We were using Stretch, and we are going to use Buster next. Yeah.
Okay, so that's great. That's an example of what I've been describing. And on the second question, I haven't personally looked at that, but I'd like to ask if anyone else in the room is using Fedora and has tried this already. Yep. Do you want to grab the mic? And if you want to share your feedback on that.
Well, I've also done my ISOs with Fedora, also CentOS, linked those back to my packages, some RPMs which I produce for things that are not commonly found on the default repos. And actually I don't have much more to add than this.
Which packages do you distribute?
Actually, FreeSwitch, for instance, it's some of them. Also, some compiled versions of Kamailio, mainly those. Some Lua thing that I also use, and that's basically it.
Okay, that's great. Do we have time for more questions? Or we have more volunteers?
We've probably got
with
time for one
questions?
more question. We're about
We
to
have
start
a
break.
few at the back, yeah.
Hi, thanks. So you mentioned the problem of the difference between the pace of development of distribution and the pace of development of RTC software. And this is not just RTC software, it's many software. And actually, it was such of a problem that for some software like web browser, they make exception to be able to update. Like for instance, Ubuntu receives new Firefox releases as like a sort of fast path. So what do you suggest to improve the situation with the Debian project in general?
Okay, so the web browsers are a very, very interesting example. So there are two web browsers, there's Chrome and Firefox, and the Debian organization has allowed those to be updated more frequently than any other package. They've made a special exception for them. And one of the reasons for that is that the web itself is constantly evolving. So the vendors of those browsers have been able to push out auto updates onto Windows machines and other platforms, and websites are evolving with that. And this has created a lot of pressure on Debian to change its policies. But you've also got other aspects of it. Like if you consider that one of those browsers is Chrome, which comes from Google, and you also have people in the Debian community who are employed by Google, Google obviously has a lot of influence in many free software organizations and events today. So it's convenient for Google getting that outcome from Debian. But from a logical perspective, the argument that they use to update Chrome and Firefox on a frequent basis is almost the same logical argument for updating all the real-time communication software at a similar pace. But it's not an argument that anyone has aggressively put forward yet. So, but I would certainly be in favour of doing more for that. So we'll wrap it up there.
Okay, thank you very much. Huge round of applause for Daniel. Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah.
Right, we now have a break for a few minutes. If you can all be back here at 3:10. There are no more sessions in the Dome. We do have a very special RTC edition of Just a Minute. Unfortunately, Nicholas Parsons sends his apologies, but Kathleen King is standing in for him. So she's hosting the event. And then after that, we have lightning talks. So an action-packed afternoon. So enjoy your break, have a coffee, and we'll see you back here in about 10-15 minutes.